EU food imports to the UK are about to get more expensive and complicated as the British government implements more parts of the Brexit deal. Since April 30th, the UK imposed checks on fresh food imports. That's a stark reversal from the era of frictionless trade when the country was part of the European Union. Ministers have delayed the change multiple times, wary of stoking inflation and the cost of living crisis, and knowing that any repeat of empty supermarket shelves caused in recent times by everything from climate change to a shortage of truck drivers would be politically toxic. But almost 8 years after the 2016 Brexit referendum, companies and consumers are now experiencing kind of end results there. Danish Crown, which exports 1,000 tons of bacon a week to the UK, said it has been preparing for the checks for a long time. With no prospect of walking away from its most important bacon market, the company is confident of making it work, as Lars Albertsen, the company's UK managing director, told media. "We have exported bacon to the UK for 130 years. It's part of our DNA," he said. Yet Albertsen also predicted smaller exporters may shy away as Britain becomes more costly and bureaucratic to trade with, leaving consumers facing more expensive produce. "It's a disaster for the UK," he said. Virtually all pork imported by the UK comes from the EU, much of it from Denmark and farms like Allen Gammelgaard's. On his 1,330 acres in Odder, about 2 hours drive north of the abattoir in Blans, he rears about 43,000 pigs a year for Danish Crown. When Brexit happened, Gammelgaard worried about the implications for a key market for his pigs. "As farmers, we couldn't do anything. It's the company who had to solve that, and they did," he said. In fact, the time the pigs spend on Gammelgaard's farm are the only part of the trade untouched by Brexit. The changes and added costs start when the pigs, now weighing about 110 kilograms, are moved by truck to the abattoir. That's because Britain requires certain food products from EU nations to arrive with health certificates signed by a vet in their country of origin. For every consignment of bacon or other pork cuttings to England, Dorte Brendekilde, who works in Danish Crown's shipping team, plugs details like the weight, departure date and destination into an EU database. It takes about 10 minutes before it goes to an on-site vet in Blans for certification as free from disease. It's then re-uploaded and stamped as valid. The result is a 5-page digital document UK authorities see when shipments arrive, each costing 120 kroner. That's about 12 pounds or something. Companies need a certificate for each product type, so for Danish Crown that usually means one per truck. Any split shipments, though, would need more. And on top of the certification costs, EU exporters now have to pay fees of up to £145 for goods like sausages, milk and fish to pass through British ports, including Dover and the Eurotunnel at Folkestone, in effect to subsidize the cost of the UK's new health checks. The British government expects the fees to raise food prices by 0.2% over 3 years. Some economists paint a bleaker picture, with restaurants, delicatessens and wholesalers facing a hit here. Alliance Trade predicts a 0.4% loss of consumer spending, and these costs will all inevitably have to be passed on to the consumers. That was said by Katie Doherty, head of the International Meat Trade Association. Still, there's little sign of Danish firms pulling out, according to Line Garbol, the head of the international trade at the Danish Veterinary and Food Administration, which set up a task force and hired 9 people for preparing exporters for Brexit. For now, Garbol said she's more concerned about what happens if the UK gets behind on spot checks, delaying delivery of perishable products. Right from the start, we took Brexit very seriously because we knew that it was an important market for our business to continue operating in, she said. Visiting every stage of the journey from Danish farm to the UK market, a picture emerges of the reality of Britain's decision to leave the EU. it's not that trade stops, it's just harder and more expensive. The 19-hour route from Esbjerg to Immingham in northern England, used by Danish Crown, had operated customs-free within the EU for decades. Now they are back to the mid-70s, as they said. For example, Christian Pedersen, the head of operations for the route at Danish shipping firm DFDS, referring to the new Brexit checks. DFDS hired 5 employees at Esbjerg to deal with border compliance. And mornings are spent on custom work for cargo arriving from the UK, from seafood and dairy products to textiles and waste used for energy. Spot checks by customs official can include the use of dogs and X-ray scanners. The work is a reminder that Brexit has upended trade for imports to the EU too. Brexit has given us the sense that we're now dealing with a third country, Pedersen said. Well, you do, Mr. Pedersen. Everybody is saying that we should compare the UK with China in terms of custom formalities. And by afternoon, attention shifts to the dozens of lorries rolling on and off of a DFDS vessel, loading about 180 trailers of goods the UK relies on from Denmark. Pork furniture and crisps feature and they check the units for the correct customs paperwork. And Danish Crown bacon is loaded into temperature-controlled trailers where it continues to cure as it travels across the North Sea. And like Gabul, Pedersen worries about the knock-on effect if British officials get behind on the Brexit checks, triggering a backlog. Some companies have already warned they'll seek other routes or stop trading with the UK altogether if port charges make the Esbjerg-Immingham route too expensive. That's of course a major concern according to Pedersen. In the UK, most ports are privately owned and set their own fees for checks, using the £145 set by the government for Dover as a guide. And this allows them to recoup what they've spent to set up and staff the border check facilities, but it's also allowed for each port to compete on price and attract trade. What that means in effect is that if Immingham raises charges too much, Esbjerg would also suffer if shippers stay away, and vice versa, of course. Though less well known than Dover, which features in any warning about post-Brexit trade friction, Immingham is the UK's largest port by tonnage. It's a key part of the wider Humber port complex, which includes Grimsby, but also Hull and Goole, handling £75 billion worth of trade a year. The region also voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, and then Prime Minister David Cameron was heckled when he visited the nearby town of Cleethorpes in June 2016, days after losing the referendum and announcing his resignation. Well, but after this 19-hour journey, cargo from Esbjerg arrives at Immingham. That's a route which had operated customs-free within the EU for decades, as I said. And you can't even imagine what now all has changed. The cost of Brexit that Cameron warned about, the end of seamless EU trade, is about to properly hit home. Associated British Ports has had to build 2 border control posts at Immingham and Hull, with only 2/3 of the £34 million cost covered by the government. Though the UK is due to implement a set of safety checks at the end of October, at which point the terms of Brexit will be fully in place in this regard, it's the health checks on food that are expected to have the biggest impact on trade. ABP has the option to recoup the remainder through setting the levies for agri-food imports. But it's not that simple, says Simon Bird, the company's director for the Humber region. I'm very mindful that we need to remain competitive with other ports and equally with our customers, he says. So no open end. When a DFDS vessel carrying Danish Crown meat and other products arrives at Immingham, UK government agencies will have told the shipping firm which units it wants to inspect under the new rules well before the ship arrives. The border control post is divided into 3 sections: for health staff checking lower risk products, for border force responsible for tackling smuggling, and the most high-tech section for vets to inspect higher risk agri-food produce. A sampling section contains fridges and a sterilized knife cabinet, and lorries reverse into one of the 17 bays at the facility, which is about a mile away from the port. And that's far from typical. At Dover, which handles a third of the UK's trade with the EU, the new facility is more than 20 miles from the port. The Dover Port Health Authority warned that it won't be able to cope, though. Moving the checks inland will undermine our entire British border and biosecurity system, creating an open door for disease and food fraud. That was said by Lucy Manzano, the authority's head, in a letter to members of parliament last month. She said the government has designed a system to release goods without checks if the facility is unable to cope. A contingency plan she described as alarming. The government's approach will be light touch to avoid disruption, is what, on the other hand, Exports Minister Malcolm Offord told media. And one of the Danish Crown's UK customers is Robert Todd, whose father started in the industry in the 1950s cutting pigs in what is now London's Smithfields market. Nowadays, Todd Meats turns over £22 million pounds a year, he said, selling pork, chicken, lamb and more things to wholesalers and catering butchers. I wasn't in favor of Brexit. I'm still not in favor of Brexit, he said, recalling how the referendum result kept him awake at night. He took classes and attended conferences to learn what would change and how to adapt. He now mostly buys produce from EU exporters who also have distribution companies in the UK, and has largely shifted to a system where the seller is responsible for any import duties and clearances rather than the buyer. If the new checks impact the supply chain, he's prepared to hold more stock in a temperature-controlled facility in Kent. The price he pays for Danish crown pork changes each time they negotiate a new contract, subject to market condition, shifts in supply and demand, and also the currency fluctuations. And this will make it difficult to see the specific Brexit impact on the price, though Todd is in no doubt there will be one once again. Companies aren't just going to absorb that cost and just go, don't worry about it. You just won't be able to find it, he said. The checks are already shifting how the trade works because of the way import and certification costs are applied to product category rather than weight. It makes more sense to buy 20 tons, for example, rather than 1. But he said many companies, particularly Spanish pork exporters, are already choosing not to sell to the UK, finding it easier to send products to Germany, for example. After the 2016 referendum, it took the UK and the EU 4.5 more years to figure out how they would keep trading. Yet it's only now that companies like Danish Crown and Todd Meats are finally dealing with what was decided. We are now doing Brexit and we'll get to see how it works out, Todd said. And this is the next step of Brexit in the food supply. But we are far from seeing the end of Brexit, or better to say, the end result of Brexit, because there's much more to come in a lot of areas still. There are still transition periods there, if you don't know that. I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.